First up today will be Kate Chisholm. Kate is the Senior Vice President and Chief Strategic and Sustainability Officer of Capital Power, and has had a long career with Capital Power and its predecessor company, EPCOR Utilities Limited. And Kate is going to talk to us about, the journey that Capital Power has had over the last few years, going from coal-fired power and renewables to, a closing down of the coal-fired assets and some of the challenges and things that are associated with that. And I'm going to now ask Kate Chisholm to take the floor. Kate, are you ready?
You bet, Jim. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So I'm going to tell you what Kate thinks. I want you to know that some of these thoughts are not endorsed by Capital Power, but you'll be able to tell the difference between the ones that are and the ones that aren't. In my opinion, the world needs to come to terms with the fact, as has been discussed, that the goal of powering the world with 100% renewables is an absolutely impossible pipe dream. I completely understand its intuitive attraction to people who don't understand energy systems, but it simply cannot be done. To be clear, I'm not saying the power grid needs to indefinitely put up with carbon emissions from thermal power, but it can't do without thermal power, so we need to decarbonize it. Recent unfortunate events like frigid weather in Texas and Alberta and drought and wildfires in California and up the West Coast illustrate the importance of backup when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining, and water isn't flowing as freely as we'd like. For example, in Alberta's record-breaking heat wave this summer, only 8 megawatts of Alberta's more than 2,000 megawatts of wind was generating. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that 8 megawatts was from Capital Power's Halkirk wind farm. Although the solar was running strong at an 84% capacity factor, the total output from all of Alberta's hydro, wind, and solar was only 570 megawatts out of the province's total 3,200 megawatts of renewable capacity, for a capacity factor of only 18%. In non-power speak, this means that on average, 82% of the power consumed in that period was from coal and natural gas. These extreme weather events are not going away. They are going to increase in intensity and in frequency. In fact, all credible studies looking at deep decarbonization scenarios predict an ongoing role for natural gas in the global electricity supply for two reasons. Firstly, they confirm the necessity of some kind of extremely fast ramping and flexibly reliable backup power, particularly as the penetration of intermittent renewable increases. In some areas, batteries will be able to smooth intermittency for short periods because they, like gas, can be dispatched and turned off instantaneously. However, in areas subject to weather events that last more than a few hours, natural gas with CCUS is a safer, non-emitting short to medium-term bet. Decarbonized natural gas will support system reliability by ensuring clean spinning reserve is always available to keep the lights on reliably and at a cost that avoids rate shock and energy poverty. The second reason experts acknowledge the ongoing importance of decarbonized natural gas relates to the developing world's growing demand for electricity and the resulting forecast growth of its coal and natural gas supply in response. The developing world can't afford to research, develop, and commercialize the tools necessary to decarbonize this part of their supply. The developed world will have to do it for them. Alberta and Canada will lead the way for CCUS and hydrogen parts of decarbonization, becoming world leaders. I agree with both the International Energy Agency and the UN's International Panel on Climate Change that using existing technology will be the only practical way to ensure that we move the needle sufficiently before 2030 to contain global warming. By the time the energy industry has designed, permitted, financed, and constructed the kind of infrastructure that will be needed to meet Canada's 2030 reduction goal, there won't be any extra time left within which to develop and deploy new technologies. First, therefore, pre-2030, point source emissions will be physically reduced where feasible through post-combustion capture or hydrogen blending. Second, where emissions can't be captured at source, due to technical, economic, or social constraints, we'll pursue negative emissions technologies such as direct air capture post-2030 to capture and remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. For example, pre-2030, Capital Power plans to be completely off coal by the end of 2023. That's a full 6 years earlier than we're required to do so. This will immediately reduce our emissions by 3.4 megatons, while also increasing our generating capacity, providing more than 40% reduction in emissions from our Genesee site, despite a more than 40% increase in its generation capacity. Because of Alberta's competitive energy market, we forecast that this repowering investment will also have a further knock-on environmental benefit of reducing the overall emissions from the Alberta power sector by another full megaton, as the increased cleaner capacity displaces higher emitting units on the merit curve. All in all, we're reducing Alberta power emissions by approximately 4.5 megatons per year within the next 2 years, but we're still burning natural gas. Next, we hope to capture the point source CO2 emissions from 2 units and sequester them to further reduce our absolute emissions at Genesee by another 3 megatons per year. We hope to have shovels in the ground on this CCUS project by the end of 2023 for a COD by the end of 2026. So that's about 7.5 megatons per year of emission reductions from these 2 projects alone. And we're still burning gas. We're also finishing the Genesee Carbon Conversion Center, which I'm particularly proud of and interested in. It will capture some more carbon from the 3rd unit out there and convert it into carbon nanotubes that we hope to be sold to raise revenue that offsets the cost of capture. Specifically, we're partnering with Lehigh Cement in the hopes that Lehigh can reduce its downstream emissions by incorporating the carbon nanotubes into its cement mixtures. Carbon nanotubes are stronger than steel, lighter than aluminum, and more conductive than copper, and we believe that incorporating them into the things like cement and steel manufacture and aluminum smelting will be very attractive for those processes as the price on carbon rises. Eventually, if enough demand can be created for the nanotubes, direct air capture units that create the nanotubes could become independently economic and be placed anywhere. Once these projects are complete, they'll have the capacity to produce something like 10,000 to 11,000 gigawatt hours, or approximately twice the clean energy of British Columbia's Site C, and enough to meet the entire Alberta residential demand. This production would be about 5 times the energy of all Alberta hydro generation combined and equal to all of the renewable energy Alberta generated last year. It is very significant. The challenge for us in producing carbon nanotubes is not technological. We already know we can do it. We've done it. The challenge is purely financial. Without a CO2 point source, there's no carbon tax avoidance to boost the economics. So we need to establish that market for carbon nanotubes or other products that can be made from them to raise revenue to cover the capture costs. In addition, because of its locational flexibility and minimal water consumption, direct air capture would be one good potential solution to upstream oil and gas emissions. The International Panel on Climate Change estimates that even if we were to reduce the world's emissions to 0, we'll still need approximately 10 gigatons of net CO2 removal per year by the year 2050 in order to keep the global temperature rise under 2 degrees. This is why, for example, the X Prize, along with Elon Musk and his foundation, are offering a $100 million prize for the best scalable carbon removal solution. To achieve the necessary scale, direct air capture will need government incentives and early CO2 utilization market opportunities to assist commercialization and allow the technologies to move more quickly along the cost reduction curve. We share our carbon conversion strategy with numerous others who have begun making hydrogen, plastics, methanol, building materials, solvents, synthetic rubber, batteries, electronics, automobiles, vodka, detergents, soaps, fertilizer, furniture, packaging, clothing, shoes, and jewelry from captured carbon. Captured CO2 can theoretically be made into any kind of fuel or chemical that is currently based on petroleum. The trick is figuring out either how to do it so the product is cost competitive with fossil fuel derived products, or convincing the public to buy carbon derived products at a slight premium because they benefit the environment. In fact, McKinsey estimates that by 2030, CO2-based products could be worth between $800 billion and $1 trillion. And the use of CO2 just for producing fuel, enriching concrete, and generating power could reduce GHG emissions by 1 billion metric tons per year. The Global Carbon Initiative further projects that with the proper government incentives, the overall CO2-based product industry could utilize 7 billion metric tons of CO2 each year, about 15% of our current global emissions by 2030. As an aside, at both COP26 and in their platform for the September election, the Trudeau Liberals said they're not willing to wait for other governments to act on climate change. And they expressly specified the important role the private sector should play in building and financing projects, and that market forces should decide technologies. Well, Prime Minister, the Alberta energy industry is ready to help, but we need policies that support innovation and commercialization and deal with geographic spillover issues like carbon border adjustments. Most of all, we need a lot less red tape, and we need to be able to better balance NIMBY interests with the greater public good. Of course, that's a difficult proposition for any politician, so public education is also very, very urgently needed. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kate. That was a great overview, a lot of information there. One interesting piece that I bumped into when I chaired the Alberta Carbon Capture and Storage Development Council back in 2009. And Dave Collier was actually on there with me, as well as Don Lowry from EPCOR, you'll recall, was that the direct capture from air seemed like a real far out idea back then. And we actually had David Keith on the panel as well. And David went on to be a professor at Harvard and continues to pursue that technology. But has it advanced a lot since those days? And is it getting to be more, possible to use and do?
There are some direct air capture units in operation at the moment. We ourselves had a very small one in operation at our Shepherd plant just outside Calgary. The problem is it's very, very expensive. And so we need to create those markets for the products made from the captured carbon to lift the economics. But it is completely technologically viable already.
Mm-hmm. That was the issue at the time, of course, too, was the cost. Well, thank you, Kate. One of the things that you've done is really highlight how much actually activity you've got going on in the behind the scenes here. And I think that that's probably true for all of industry in Canada. We never see it. We never read about it. And I'm not even sure that governments totally appreciate it because it's hard for them to process all of this stuff. But I think therein lies, some of the solution on a path forward. It's going to be a bumpy road, but we've got a lot of things going on and a lot of willingness to try to do some things to help solve this.
I think we can all agree, voters, consumers, and investors are the same person, and they really fundamentally don't understand this. And Ilona has suggested that we need a better story. And I've got to tell you, Ilona, lots of big brains have been working on that elevator speech for a very long time. The problem is it is so complex, it's very difficult to reduce. And so what we have now is a whole bunch of people that are getting their science off of headlines and tweets and so on. And it's very, very difficult to combat that because they're oversimplistic. They're intuitively attractive because they're so much easier to understand than the real poop. And we really need to educate it. My frustration, I guess, is I participate in webinars like this quite frequently, and it seems like I'm always talking to the choir. And somehow, I think probably to Dave's very good point, we have to bring in the people elsewhere in the church too and have those conversations with them. But I really enjoyed this very much, and thank you for the opportunity.